I'm going to talk about, Jan Assmann's ideas about monotheism and the creation of a canon. Now, can anyone tell me what a canon is? Spelled like that, not a canon that blows people up. But a canon spelled with one N. Have any of you come across this word before? Yes.
Law?
Law? No, there is something called canon law, and that's confusing because it means something different. So canon law is what priests set up in the Catholic Church. So that's laws about behaviour of clergy. So good answer, but not the one I was looking for. Does anyone else know another meaning of the word
Bible?
Bible? Yes, that's right. So the Bible is part of a canon. Can anyone think of any other examples of canon?
When something becomes, fixed, something that becomes, rigid.
Yes,
That's
right. That's right. So you can say the reason that the Bible is an example of canon is because the Bible has a fixed number of books in a set order. There has been an agreement by people. How that agreement occurred is unclear, to be perfectly honest. It's unclear how the books of the Bible have actually come about. But there has been an agreement that there should be books of the Bible and they should be in a certain order. And the same thing can be applied to the Quran or the Avesta or any other collections of holy literature. They aren't individual fragments that circulate. Here's a bit of Quran, that's nice, and I'll change that bit, and I'll pass it on to someone else. That's not acceptable, but it's deemed unacceptable because it's part of a canon. In the same way that Shakespeare is also canonized. You can say there is agreed that certain plays are by Shakespeare and certain plays are not by Shakespeare. Now, if I come along and write a play and write William Shakespeare at the top and try and sell it to Ashas, get up a new Shakespeare play, Ashas will say, no, it's agreed what all the Shakespeare plays are. That's a forgery, that doesn't belong in the canon. So, have I made some?
No.
Yeah, so it's a word that it doesn't just pertain to religious works. It's a word that means there's a body of literature, possibly of different sources, that has acquired a beginning and an end and a set structure. And that other people can't come along and add extra things into the canon. And the canon may have a relationship to other texts that are more fluid, but the canon is relatively firm. And so the Bible's a good example of that. The Bible's a good example, so are other religious texts, but so too are works of literature. Now in this lecture, I'm going to talk about three big examples. I'm going to talk about Homer's Greece. I'm going to talk about Judaism during the exile, chiefly, but I'm also going to talk about the development of the rabbis. And then I'm going to talk about Christianity in the age of Constantine, or we call political monotheism. And I don't expect you to know about the history of any of these periods. In fact, I've deliberately chosen these to be things to put you all on the same level playing field. I know fully well that most of this stuff is not taught in school. If you happen to know about it, that's wonderful, and please share your knowledge. But I've deliberately chosen things that you don't know about, so I can render them in relatively simple terms. So I'll try and give you the skeleton. I'm going to try and give you the skeleton, so you don't be. The aim is not to worry you with detail, and in your assessments, I'm not going to test you on this. I'm not going to test you and say, what did Rabbi so-and-so say about the treatment of women? Nothing like that. I'm doing this to whet your appetite. Because the questions you get, and we'll come to the questions, your midterm questions at the end of this session, the questions you get for Secular Cross Cultures, the midterm and the end term, you can use whatever examples you like. If you want to talk about Indonesia, if you want to talk about Gilgit, if you want to talk about England, absolutely fine. My requirement is that you engage with the concepts of the literature. So the precise examples I use here aren't something you should worry about too much. I use them as examples because that's what's being used often by the theory. So one of the lessons I want to teach you in this lecture, and in the other lectures the first half of the term, is that theories have been built using certain case studies. So no theory is divorced from a set of case studies. People tend to be interested in one situation first, and then use that to develop a general theory. And the point of looking at another set of case studies is to test that theory. It's to say, hey, you said this works for Homer's Greece. Dr. Wood, you said that works for Jews in the 4th century. It doesn't work for Gilgit in the 19th century, so it's not a general theory. Then you say, why doesn't it work? Then you refine the theory. Then you say, these things are different. These are the variables, and this is how we can tell what effect these variables have. So, is my method clear? So I don't want you to worry over much about individual details. What I want you to remember is the big picture. But all the slides are on Moodle, so you always have an opportunity to go and look at them there. Bushra said that she sent them all around to you, all of those slides. Did you get them all? Is everyone?
Well, we have them on Moodle.
Yes, you've seen them all on Moodle. Okay, that's fine. Has anyone not seen the slides? Anyone wanting to see the slides? You've seen them all. Great. And you'll see here also that I'm going to touch on several issues that pertain to what I said in the Geertz lecture. So if you remember, I talked about the differences between traditional and rational religion, according to Weber's definitions. I'm going to touch on some of those other issues here again today. Okay, so the French anthropologist Lévi-Strauss, who worked on Latin America, famously divided societies into hot societies and cold societies. And Lévi-Strauss says that cold societies are societies that are relatively equal, they're egalitarian. There are no kings in cold societies. There's no, you don't have developed hierarchies of priests or of nobilities. And he provides the example of the Asagi, who are peoples of pre-colonial North America. And he describes the central ritual of the Asagi year. So all the tribes of the Asagi come together to one place. So they're normally nomadic, they can live in the same place. And they all come together and celebrate with a great fire. And they tell the stories of the different ancestors of the tribes. And there are 24 tents set up around this great fire for each of the tribes. And Lévi-Strauss gives us a classic example of the kinds of myth and rituals produced by cold peoples, those peoples who don't have to. The purpose of this myth is not to justify hierarchy. It's not to justify. It's not to justify any kind of inequality. It's simply to tell the origin of a people and to say and to explain a current political situation with reference to an imagined distant past.
So I had a slightly hard time in understanding. Like I could understand what the hot society is about.
Yes, sure.
Okay, who have internalized their history, who have symbols. But what about cold society? Why do they want to distance themselves from the history?
Sure. So we all live in hot societies.
Yeah.
So we all live in societies with hierarchy, and our presumptions are created by living in societies with inequality. So Lévi-Strauss would say that's why we find it hard to think about this kind of world.
Yeah.
So this is a kind of world that can constantly readapt narratives. So say the point of the story, the point of the Asagi creation myth, becomes saying there are 24 gods, say, and their children are the 24 tribes.
Yeah.
But Assmann or Lévi-Strauss would say the advantage of living in a cold society, in a society that has a highly developed sense of history, is if one of these tribes is wiped out, then okay, there were 23 gods. You can change the past to accommodate the present.
Okay.
So that's what happens in these societies. So there are the only reference points in history are the distant mythic past, and what's happened far, far, long before anyone can remember, and the present. That's all there is. Perhaps I should. I need a marker, but I don't have one. So
Marker.
no, they're just fit for that. So I'll try and write it with a firing so you can see. So this is when the world was created, and that's now. That's the present. And there's nothing in between. That the present is the situation in the present is used to describe, is used to write the distant past.
Okay, so if a particular society or any particular culture
Yes.
is not changing the facts, but it is changing the interpretation of that fact, would that count as a cold society? For example, if a society is constantly readapting the interpretation of fall of Adam from heaven?
I think not. Well, I don't know. I mean, actually, Levi-Strauss presents that society is either hot or either cold.
Yeah.
But in practice, you just have to think of these as ideal models. I would suggest that probably no, you'll probably have to talk about hot society. Don't worry about this too much.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we come and talk about hot and cold? And once we've talked about both of them, then we can look back at them and see if you have any more questions. So one of the classic examples of this alteration is a myth, recitation myth story that an anthropologist called Jack Goody looked at in West Africa. And the people he looked at are called the Bagre. And this was an example of a creation myth that changed in response to changing situations. Because recitations of the Bagre myth in the beginning of the 20th century have 8 brothers who were all descended from the gods. And these brothers each found a tribe among the Bagre people. But then one of these tribes rebels against the British, and the British they strip the chief of all his power, and they reallocate members of that tribe to all the other tribes. So there's only 7 tribes. And when Jack Goody comes along and records the myth, there are only 7 brothers. The past has changed to accommodate the present. And we can reflect on that. So that's the tension. This is what can happen in a cold society. But we couldn't imagine something similar happening with the Bible or the Quran. If people decide that, okay, homosexuality is okay, you can't then write a verse in the Quran to say, and then homosexuality is fine. You can't change the text. It's a closed canon. You can't say the present has changed, so the past needs to change to accommodate it. We live in societies with closed canons. We live in hot societies. So one of the key things that is being described for these relatively simple, I mean, I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. These are societies slightly less complex. They're not heavily urbanized. They're not canonized. There's not wide use of literacy. In these kinds of societies, much easier to change the past.
So as long as it is a tradition and has not become a cultural memory in the literary form.
Yes, exactly. It's not been written down. It's not been written down. Now, another aspect of pre-literate myth is what Weber describes as amoral religion. That you describe your interest in the past and the interest in, and that includes the creation of the world. Your interest in the religious past is to describe the natural phenomena that you see around you. Yes.
Sorry to
yeah,
the previous thing that
yeah.
we were discussing. So if it's a tribe,
yeah.
this is discussing that. In other part of the chapter, there was a comparison made between communicative memory
yes.
and cultural memory, and it was mentioned that communicative memory is retained for a lesser period of time, and whereas cultural memory is comparatively retained for a long period of time because of the text and every other thing. So if it's a tribe which this is not retaining any textual any scripture, how can it retain? Like if it's only because it's a myth, that's why they can retain it for a long time, or
so if something's repeatedly told, that is a repeated story, but it may also be a story where the details can be altered. So everyone knows there are brothers descended from the gods, and that they form the tribes. Everyone knows that. But everyone will also know that people are prepared to accept the alteration of details in those stories. So the storytelling functions in a culture which is familiar with and tolerant of alterations of details in those stories. That would, I think, be how we understand it. So.
But it should be oral one, right? Not
yes, this is oral.
The only condition is that
yes.
it should be oral.
Yes, that's one of the preconditions that we're dealing with oral societies. Now, I don't want to complicate it more than that, but I'll come on to that. We can fine-tune it a bit more later, but that's what I want to start off with. One of the preconditions for this ability to change the past is orality. Now, I think that we can see several elements of Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, those great sort of Homeric myths of the Greeks, as examples of myths that have originated in relatively egalitarian societies. These are societies without very stationary hierarchies, that aren't heavily urbanized. They're often pre-literate. Often the heroes described in these worlds can't read and write. And I think that these are also worlds, this also describes a world where man's understanding of the gods is really to understand natural phenomena. You see that there are earthquakes, you see that there are storms, you see that horrific things happen to good people, and you have to try and understand these phenomena. And these phenomena are attributed to the gods, which makes gods sometimes the allies of men and sometimes their enemies. But it doesn't make gods supreme controllers of a morality. Gods have no more care for morality than any men do. Morality doesn't flow from gods. Gods don't set down the law. Gods just have power. And this is an environment, these stories tell the story of the antagonism between gods and men. So this is an environment where worship, sacrifice to the gods, is to do with offence. If you fail to sacrifice to a god, you fail to acknowledge your debt to him. He may control you for one reason or another, of course, who you are, where you were born, your profession. If you're a fisherman, you fail to sacrifice to Poseidon. Poseidon will punish you, because it's like putting your goats on his land. And the gods can engage in massive injustices. Hera destroys, Hera, who's the wife of Zeus, destroys the city of Troy, and Zeus agrees to let his wife do it as a favour to her. So the massive injustices committed against men are just described as favours between gods and goddesses, and he says you can do this even though it's the city most precious to me. Now, it's not a text without morality, but the morality is always generated by individual men. So here is Odysseus slaughtering the suitors who've come to try and marry his wife, Penelope. He kills them all when he returns from the Trojan Wars. And here is Odysseus who decides that he's better than all of his crew, who can listen to the sirens, who sing beautiful songs and lure sailors to their death. And he has the crew you know these stories perhaps, yeah. I'll tell you if you don't. He tells the crew to put wax in their ears and to keep on rowing. And he's the only man who can listen to the beauty of the song. He wants to have the experience for himself, and he ties himself to the mast, has himself tied to the mast. And he screams to be released, but the sailors can't hear him because they have the wax in their ears. And the sirens sing and try and lure the ship onto the rocks. So he presents himself as better than his crew because he's a hero. But it's not because he's more moral than them, it's because he has more bravery, more courage. He's shown himself in battle. This is where his superior position is. And here is the depictions of the fall of Troy, when Priam, king of the Trojans, weeps before the feet of Achilles and asks for the body of his son Hector to be returned, and pays for it in its own weight in gold so that he can bury it with the proper rites. Now these are nasty men. This is a story without, the heroes of this story are not good men, but this is the foundational text of Western civilization. And it greatly appalled people like Aristotle and Plato, who desperately tried to inject a morality into these stories. The absence of morality really troubles people in 5th century Athens. From an urbanized world where people talk politely to one another, who believe in a shared morality, they try and interpret these stories as if they are moral tales. And it continues to trouble Christians who read these texts in the 4th century AD. They interpret the deeds of Odysseus as parables that can be read in a Christian sense, and Muslims do the same in the 9th century. These are texts that are troubling to societies where they expect religion and society to have a shared functional morality. Right, so I've suggested that these two features of cult society, of memory in cult society. One is it has little to do with morality, it has little to do with expected behaviour. And in this sense, It's very similar to what Weber has described as traditional religion. So we've had that in a previous lecture, thinking about that as an aspect of religion. Here, we're thinking about it as kind of memory. The way that societies remember the past isn't used to justify behaviour, it's used to justify good behaviour and bad behaviour.
So, whenever this particular task is taking place in a society that the narration of the past is redefined or refactuated, isn't there any conflict within the society that some people resist the change? That how can you just randomly cut from 24 to 23 gods, or how can you add morality to it?
We would expect that, wouldn't we?
Yeah.
We would expect that. I think the answer is that if you have a situation where one of these tribes has just been liquidated,
Yeah.
the British have come along, there is no more tribe anymore, and there's simply no way of resisting that, people move with the wind. So I think Goody, I've not read Goody's text on the Baghdad recitation for a little while, so it's a bit hazy in my memory. And this was his PhD, interestingly, very earliest work. I take him to mean that there is a common understanding that the function of stories is not to tell a literal truth, but to tell a useful one. They're telling a useful truth about present society, and that's done through talking about the past. But it's a past that no one can remember.
So you look in a similar way in the 9th century of the formation of Muslim texts, the compilation.
No, but it's a written material.
No, but it got subscribed in the 9th century. It wasn't there.
Interesting. Thank you. That's an excellent counterexample. I think if you have an environment where people have rival vested interests, that's slightly different. Goody's talking about an environment where everyone can agree that this tribe doesn't exist anymore, so there's no point of including them in the story. The other thing is that you're talking about a world that is literate, even though Hadith texts, for instance, don't get written down, allegedly, until the 9th century. They're still living in a world with literacy.
Yeah.
They're living in a world with a state bureaucracy and with qadis who are dispensing justice partly on the basis of what the Hadith purport you to say. So I would say it's actually a literate world. No literate world has no aspect of morality, but I'm talking now, but we're talking about writing. So I would say that Hadith fit into that kind of world. So yes, it's something that demands a specific kind of analysis, but I don't think it mirrors what he's describing for the Baghdad. And I think it's also fitting into a kind of culture that, at least by the 9th century, wants to describe a truth about the past, wants to describe something that's true.
But the useful truth, not the literary truth.
Yes. Well, there's a bit of both, I suspect, but I think there's always a bit of both. I think people in hierarchalized societies like ours are always inclined to exaggerate how far stories are true and how far they're told because they're useful. And we may lie to ourselves. Sometimes we say things that are funny, that they're not literally true, but they serve everyone laughs, so it's a good story. Or the police often comment that where people who see a murder occur, no one ever tells the same story, no one gives the same description. People find it very hard to identify a murderer who's unknown to them. Those aren't necessarily the kinds of things that sit easily in memory. So it's a question of what we are culturally primed to remember, what we're concerned about, what aspects of events, what are we concerned about monitoring? We can't monitor everything. Now, Assmann contrasts what's going on in these relatively egalitarian nomadic societies with what happens in societies like Egypt or Assyria. And Assmann is writing as an Egyptologist, and he says that these societies, like Egypt and Assyria, they use ritual to create moments of commonality to compensate for hierarchy, compensates for it. So he says you can participate in something like the death ritual for a king, a grand funeral, and it's a ritual that shows everyone that they're Egyptian, but it also shows everyone their place within an Egyptian hierarchy. So there's an impression of an eternal past without rupture. There's no there's no notion of development here, no time before kingship. The past is conceived as a succession of kings. So this is different from our cold society. So here we've got creation. There's creation, it's like in there. And then, and God is like, the gods are like the initial kings. And then there's a succession of kings. One king succeeding another until we get to the current king. So politics and society is all seen through the image of the kings, the image of kingship. Kingship becomes central to these early hot societies like Egypt and Assyria. That they show their power, and if you doubt it, you can see the obelisk, you can see the pyramids, you can see the Sphinx, you can see this re-sculpting of the landscape by the kings around which their rituals are concentrated. And if you're an Egyptian peasant, you know that ultimately your labour goes towards producing these things. It makes you who you are. So you have a process you can participate in. Now, you could say that these processes are also oppressive. This is what is used to justify placing individuals under immense pressure of taxation or of labour call-outs, that kind of thing. But one of the reasons they may find it convincing to do that, one of the reasons they may collude in their own oppression, is because these great buildings that they build, or the king's army, or the king's state, it creates their world, it creates the only way they know, the only way of being. So Asman points out hieroglyphic writing is very sophisticated in Egypt, but it's used to record rituals. And king lists is not used to record canons or histories. But the only way of seeing the past is through the succession of the kings. That all of the ways that the landscape is moulded and the past is conceived, they all go to reinforcing the power of their kings and their dominance over everything. But it's something that's restrained to this territory. It's only effective because of the repetition of these rituals in these places. You could take an Egyptian and move him to Sicily or move him to India. He just has ceased to be an Egyptian. All of these things depend on the repetition of these rituals in these places. Now, the third case I want to show you is societies where you have a canon. Societies where canonical texts have been developed and where nuanced histories can be written about the past. So histories that can accommodate frequent change different forms, change about things other than just kingship. And Jack Goody gives these interesting examples. So Goody talks about the Kikuyu or the Ashanti or the Dinka, when we looked at the Dinka in our first lecture. And these are all groups that would fall into Levi-Strauss's cult societies. They're all examples of cult societies. These are groups with infinite variety in what people do. There's no management of custom. People can do whatever they like. And these are worlds without a clear separation between custom and religion. Custom and religion just flow into one another. That was one of the things we saw with the Dinka society that seems to venerate cows, but doesn't really have, there's no clear understanding of how that deeply rooted veneration of a cow has any relationship to God or gods. What changes for Goody between both the cold and hot societies we've seen already? So there's two nomadic societies that speak, or unurbanized societies that speak about the present in relation to a mythic past, or about these primitive societies like Egypt and Assyria, where the past is only conceived through king lists, through these undifferentiated images of rule, is that you start to get texts that describe the history of a people, that give that people a notion of being, but also a way to remember themselves. They're told how to remember. And that's what he sees as distinctive about Abrahamic religion. Is this peculiar memory that can force abandonment of other practices that are extraneous, it can force memory, and it can prevent flexibility. It says, can I just worship a few other gods? So no, there's only one God. Oh please, just a few other gods. My grandfather used to worship these ones. No, no more gods. No more gods. And there's a control of memory, there's a control of what you can consider important, of what you can consider binding. There's clear separations between custom and religion. And these are some of the distinctive features of monotheist canon. Also within that environment, Usman and Goody both suggest that one of the things you see are the generalization of examples. You remember a fact from the past, not only because it explains the actions of people in the past, but so those actions can be repeated in the present. So you become interested in gathering up important examples of past behaviour and extrapolating from that a moral code. So the Ten Commandments don't just say, don't kill other Jews, or don't kill other people from Jerusalem. It says, do not kill in general. There's a general rule that's being told to people. Killing people is wrong. And that's a rule that's extrapolated from multiple examples of murder that are all taken together. Put all these together, you get a general rule. Killing people is wrong. So I'm going to try and draw it in a different shape here. So you have a canon. So here's the present. And it can think about a significant religious past. And this religious past doesn't just describe the actions of gods, it encompasses the actions of men. It says that these men were prophets or divinely appointed kings or judges, and their actions are praiseworthy actions in different situations. So it says, we realize that human beings live through multiple different situations in different places, but God is with them in each of these places. And the writers of the text say, we realize that times change, and we can write rules that deal with these changing times. And that, I think, is the innovation of the development of canon. Now, I realise this is complicated, and I've thrown lots of stuff at you. I'm going to summarise it all once more. Do you want to ask any questions or have any criticisms of these models now? Can you see what I've written on the board? I'll go and find a marker in a moment when I give you a break. I'm going to give you a break in a moment. Do you want me to run through the models again? Is that useful? Sorry?
Last one.
The last one. Perhaps I'll start from the top and then work down. So up at the top, you've got the present, and there's a few old people who can remember what happened 30, 40 years ago, but beyond that, people can't remember anything. And everyone in this culture is oral. No one can write, no one can read. In this environment, there is a tradition of talking about the past, but the very, very distant past. You talk about the creation of the world. And when you talk about gods and God, they only deal with the creation of the world. You don't remember stories, really, about the interaction between gods and men. And you remember that the gods had 7 children, and they correspond to the number of tribes that there are. So the past is used to explain how the present has come to be. But the past doesn't supply morality. Doesn't supply morality at all. It's an example. This fits into what Weber calls traditional. So this is cold. Now the next example is what I suppose we could call hot and ritualized. This is limited in space. There's a way of remembering the past now. You can now remember a distant past. You can remember politics. You only remember politics as it is now. You back project what you currently have into the past, but it's only really about remembering kingship. There's no notion of peoplehood beyond kingship. You can't separate kings and people. And you can't really separate kings and divinity. These are divine kings. their centrality society is remembered because they're all sons of the god, or descended from the god. Often in these kinds of societies, the people aren't of divine origin. Only the kings are. Does that make sense?
No.
No. Okay, so in these kinds of, I'm talking about Assyria or Egypt. So in these are kinds of societies where there is a way, people are literate, there's some people who are literate, and they record what's happened in the past, but that record is limited to the succession of kings. This king ruled, and then this king ruled, and then this king ruled, and then this king ruled. And you can remember that there was a creation by gods, but there's no way of thinking about the world that isn't connected to where you live now. It's territorialized. It's connected to rituals. Everything is locked into the, a world that's highly ritualized. So these rituals justify why you should obey the king, why you should pay the taxes. But I think the key point to take away from these kinds of ancient societies is that these rituals are not really exportable. They're all to do with one state. If you're an Assyrian and you move country, or you're an Egyptian and you move country, you don't take the Sphinx with you. You don't take the pyramids with you. These rituals all pertain to the land where you live now. It's all about making the Nile make the land fertile, or making sure the king's rule protects you. If you live in another place, those rituals don't speak to you anymore. They're not transportable. So, and here we've got canon. So this is a society that's evolved a religious canon. This is a society like ancient Judaism, for instance. And this is really what we're interested in this lecture. The rest of the lecture is going to be, what are the effects of having a canon on memory? We can observe that the distant past, the creation of the world, is linked to human history, and both of those things are described in the Bible. It's not just about the creation of the world by God, it's also about the deeds of men and women who are approved of by God. And if you add together all of the actions of men and women who have God's approval, you come up with a moral code. You're saying, oh, if that's good and that's good and that's good, well, in general then, it must be good not to kill people. Those kinds of debates are occurring in that kind of society that produces this sort of text. It's moralizing, it's interested in morality. Religion has taken on a new function. Religion has started to be concerned by morality, general morality. So it doesn't just say don't kill Jews, it says don't kill in general. It's not just about one tribe or one place, it's interested about people in general. And that's a crucial effect, I think, of the link that's been made between the past as it pertains to God and the past as it pertains to people in general. Now, this is complex stuff, I realise that. I'm going to talk more about the issue of canon in a moment using Assman's work, but does this chime with what you read in Assman? Yeah. I mean, so this is very much a lecture intended for you when you've sort of read and thought about Assman, so it's sort of relate to your thoughts about Assman. Yes.
So, in this third type of society,
Yep.
Don't you think there is an embedded issue within the system? Because, for example, all these societies where there is canonized text, their morality society is derived from that text.
Yep.
Okay. So, taking an example of all the Muslim countries today,
Right.
they derive their morality from the Quran and the 6th, 7th, 8th century of Prophet and his early companions. Okay. That's why even today, all those, for example, slavery is not considered to be as bad as it is considered in West, or the undermining of role of women is not considered, giving them equal rights is not considered even today because it is corroborated in those canonized texts.
I mean, we'll come on to issues of interpretation next week. I'll just note in passing here that there's plenty of passages in the Bible that say they don't even say slavery is fine, they just take it for granted.
Yeah.
So there's plenty of parts of the Bible, which is foundational document in the West, as well, and to use the term in the West. Slavery is perfectly plenty of people in 19th century USA thought that slavery was fine and used their Bible to justify it. So there's I think the issue has to sort of rest with interpretation. So there's plenty of things that are supported in canons that people ignore. There's parts of St. Paul that say that women should be veiled in church.
Is it appropriate to say that over the years or during the last century, the authenticity or authority of that particular text has undermined, like of Bible in West in particular?
Not necessarily. It's just that interpretations always differ. I don't think it's.
The authority
I
has.
don't think it's to do with secularization per se. The people who overthrow slavery are not secularists. They interpret their Bible differently from the people who support slavery. Yes.
What happens when the people of present society are unable to find the answers of their problems from their past?
Well, that is a tension. That is a tension. Right. I've given you a lot to think about, possibly too much. So if you have any questions, come ask me. If there's things you didn't want to say, then please come ask me. 10 minutes, so come back at 5:02. Right, it's 5:02 now, so I'll start work again. So I'll read you out I'll send you these in an email, but I think it might be good to send you the 4 questions I've said. So I'm asking for 2,000 words, and you have to answer 1 question of 4, and I'll tell you those 4 questions now. I'll send you this in an email. How and why have different cultures sought to divide organized and popular religion? Question 2. What is the role of religious ideas in dividing public and private space? Question 3. Under what conditions do societies acquire religious specialists? And question 4. What is the role of scriptural canons within religion? So I hope there's something there that might suit your interests. If you really find it difficult, if you think all those sound really boring, I'd like to try something else, then come and talk to me. But it needs to be something that's related to these questions, to this material. I've asked you to also look at 2 different religious traditions, and I suggest that you need to look at least 5 items for this exercise. 5 items, 5 books or articles. I think that should be within your capabilities.
Yeah, I think that.
If you want to, if you're writing about an area that you won't know well, so you're writing about your hometown, bear in mind that you might also need some academic literature to support it. So no one knows about the place they live in an academic sense unless they've read something. You don't just know it naturally. But you're perfectly welcome to write about it. That's fine. And I've asked you to write about at least 2 different religious traditions. And you can define those however you like. Do you have any questions about that assignment? So that's 2,000 words. And it's going to look rather different from the other kind of assignments you do this term. It'll look more like assignments you do for other courses and other terms. So most of your assignments at ISMC will be done through essays. And I'm asking this back from you at the end of the reading. So you have all of the reading week to do it. And if you want to write a draft and talk to me about it or send it to me, I can write comments. If you'd like to do that, please do it in good time. So I'm not going to do it last minute. But if you send it let's say if you send it 3 days before the deadline, I'll read it. So I'll promise to read anything you send, as long as you send it 3 days before the deadline. So that's my promise to you. If you want to meet me in person to talk about it, please can you write to me in good time and we'll try and arrange a time. Or if we can't meet in person, then I can speak to you over Skype. And if you want to submit a draft, you don't have to. If you want, please can you find 3 areas where you want feedback. So I'm not just going to mark it for you and say, B+, this is what you should do to get an A, and then you do it to get an A. It has to be, have I dealt with this appropriately? Is this convincing? Is there enough bibliography on this? You have to specify the areas where you're not sure, and then I'll respond to you. And I'll mark up a couple of paragraphs just in terms of use of English and prose, so you can mimic that in the rest of your writing. But I'm not going to go through the whole of your article and correct spelling mistakes. So Just be warned, that's not my role. I'm not a spell checker. You have one on your computer. And you can always, I think the best thing to do in terms of improving your style is share your essays. Give it to a friend. Give it to a friend to ask them to help you. Give it to one of the second years. Study together. That's really good. It's not cheating. That's how you develop. So if you want to quietly say, oh, I thought Philip Wood's idea here was dreadful, I didn't agree with it at all, and you don't want to say that to me, you're very welcome to, then you can say it to a friend and talk about it. Or talk about something you've read in the readings, what you find useful, what you didn't find useful. And one of the things I'd really like to see you do is critique the theories, the theorists that you read. Talk about what you find useful, what you find not useful, and tell me why. Say where you think their generalizations work, and where you think they don't work. You're using your specialized knowledge, the things that you know yourself, well, using it to critique general statements. That's really what this exercise is about. Is that being clear? Yeah. Okay. Now I'll send you the document over the next couple of days. So I've given you a heads up so you know what's going to be involved. Please use the ISMC library. If you find there's things you want to get hold of that you can't see, look in SOAS or look in the British Library. The British Library has a copy of almost every book written in English. There is really no excuse not being able to find literature. If you want help with bibliography, if you say, oh, I want to write about this, but I don't know the literature, then you can ask me. I can't guarantee that I will know, because you can feasibly write about anything. But I can try and push you in the direction of something I find interesting. So is that okay? So in part, this is a research exercise. I'm telling you to go and find the right books. You need to use study of religions literature, but you'll also need to find books that pertain to the religious traditions you've decided to write about. So you need to be able to find books, and to be able to draw up your own bibliography and find books. The other thing I would say is the thing that always goes wrong on these essays, and one of the important things I'm trying to teach you, is don't talk about religion in general. Don't say, in Islam, people can do X, because that's a generalization that you can't sustain. You can say, in the Quran it says, and it's interpreted here to mean this. Or you can say, in Gilgit, Islam is commonly understood to require people to do this. Or in Gilgit, this is justified in Islamic terms. That's fine. But to say, give generalizing statements about Islam, whatever that is, you need to define it, you need to prove it. And you cannot do that in 2,000 words. So it's just not practical. So make claims that are practical and provable. So that's it. Right, so that's the assignment. So I'm going to talk some more about the canon. And I'll talk about how the canon works. So I've given you that background about hot and cold society. And that's important because that's what Assman, Goody, and others use in their theorization. But I want to focus here in the second part of the lecture on Assman's ideas and why Assman thinks the canon is so distinctive. And I'm going to focus in particular on Assman's writings on the book of Deuteronomy. And so this is the last part of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament that were reported to have been discovered in a pillar in the Jewish temple during the reigns of the kings who came after Solomon. And I'm going to talk about what the effects of these instructions in the book of Deuteronomy are, according to Assman. So Assman says that a canon involves trusting what was given to ancestors over current time. In a sense, then, it reverses the relationship we saw here. Here, you say that you admire the ancestors, you say that you come from the gods, but in practice, you change the story to correspond to the present. Whereas here, what has been determined by the ancestors, what the ancestors have determined that God said, or that the holy people did, determines your behavior now in the present. So if there's a disconnect between the present and the past, it's the fault of the present. You can't just change the past. So in Assman's terms, what is solid and fixed and normative replaces things that are fluid and protean, that means constantly changing, and communicative. He situates the greatest shift in memory in human history in the experiences of the Jews. The experiences of the Jews in response to a number of disasters that overtook the land of Israel in the 8th to 4th century BC. So the kingdoms of Judah and Israel had enjoyed a rule by a powerful monarchy who had sponsored priests. And this rule was abruptly ended by conquests by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And then the Jews were taken into exile into Babylon. And there in Babylonian exile, they were eventually sponsored by the Persian king, who invited the Jewish priests to organize Jewish history into sacred books. And those books form the main part of what we now think of as the Old Testament. The Persians encouraged the people they ruled to codify their laws. And they did this to make them easy to rule, to make it clear, if you're a Jew, how you ought to be behaving, and who's going to collect your taxes, who's in charge of you. So, but what the Persians do in order to make the rule of subject peoples effective empowers some of those subject peoples. By saying, right, Atash, you're going to be in charge of collecting taxes from the rest of the class. Everyone has to give everyone has to give your pocket money to Ashnash. So it gives him a symbolic power over the rest of you, if not a practical power. Probably gives him a practical power too, if he says, Shakir, I want double money this week, and he has some kind of means of authority to get that. The king has supported him. So this is something that what the Persians are doing gives special power to the priests, or gives special power to communal leaders among the different communities that the Persians rule. But what's special about the Jews is they create a set of injunctions against polytheism. The Jewish priests use their position to tell everyone else, Jews who believe in many gods are not proper Jews. They don't get a say. They don't get a say in how the community runs. They don't get a say. They don't get to participate in the rituals. They get excluded. So the many gods is dangerous. Many gods are bad. And they're saying this because they live in a multicultural environment. They're surrounded by other communities who are also ruled by the Persians. And they want to make sure that Jews don't intermarry with those communities. They want to make sure that Jews don't borrow ideas from those communities. Because if that starts to happen, then the priests will lose their influence. Their influence, their control of the Jews, is only maintained insofar as they can keep those Jews Jews. So we talked before about ritual communities. We talked before about how Egypt and Syria are built around these really important territorial rituals. You say, this ritual is going to make sure the Nile floods, this ritual is going to make sure the king prospers and can defend us. All right, fine, that's great. The Jews don't have any of that. They don't live in Israel anymore. They don't have any kings. Their rituals adapt to that, but not only that, their texts adapt to that. Their texts start to tell a story. There's more than just the succession of kings. It starts to tell a story about a people, about how a whole people has a special relationship to God, and how God hates anyone who falls outside that realm, how God hates people who adopt other gods, people who compromise, people who borrow, people who marry away. So, in Assmann's terms, it's not just a ritual community, like Assyria or Egypt. The Jews have become a textual community, and this is associated with exile. The Jews become a textual community through the process of exile. You have to keep on emphasizing how things are done back in Israel, because you're telling people this who've never been to Israel. You're telling people how to behave as a diaspora. So I'm going to go through a number of different features of the Deuteronomic instructions that Assmann emphasizes, and we're going to talk about different aspects of how that seals off the Jews from other populations, how it allows them and encourages them to remember a distinctive past, and how implicitly that gives power to a certain group of people. I should give a note first about when these texts are written. They are probably first composed in the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. So they're probably first composed while kings are still reigning in Israel, and they describe a movement of peoples. They describe the situation that happens after the Jews have invaded and conquered Israel from the Canaanites. Then these texts are then compiled and disseminated in Persia after the Jewish exile. So there's two different phases in which these texts are written down. I don't want to talk about the details of that, but you should have that at the back of your mind. So the first thing that Aslan picks out from the book of Deuteronomy is this reminder that you should only worship one God. You saw no form of any kind the day when the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the fire. So this is when Moses heard the voice of God coming out of the burning bush. Therefore watch yourself carefully, so that you do not become corrupt and make for yourself an idol, an image of any shape, whether formed like a man or a woman. And when you look up at the sky and see the sun and the moon and the stars, do not be enticed into bowing down to them and worshipping the things that the Lord your God has appointed to all nations under the heaven. So everyone's got that. Everyone can see the stars. You have something special. You have the Lord, who's special to you because you are the chosen people. As for you, you have something that says you have a special history, a special relationship. The Lord took you and brought you out of the iron smelting furnace, out of Egypt, to be the people of his inheritance, as you now are. How is that inheritance shown? It's shown in the land. It's the land of Canaan. You've defeated the Canaanites, and this land has been given to you. So the text is saying, you have a special relationship with God, and that means you have to ignore the gods of other peoples. Your special relationship depends on you acknowledging the jealousy of God. And here are the people of Israel worshipping one of the gods of the Canaanites, worshipping the golden calf. Of course, this is necessary to say, because there are Jews who behave just like other people. There are Jews who worship the many gods, who behave just like their neighbours. There are Jews who marry Canaanites. This is said in reaction to that kind of behaviour. One of the other things, so the second thing on Aslan's list, is education. These prescriptions that you should know that you are a special people only work if you tell your children that you're a special people, and that's embedded in the text itself. Impress on your children. Talk to them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. So telling your children about being Jewish, about having this special relationship with God, about how God is jealous, those are all things that the canon tells you to do. The canon tells Jews to tell people about itself. You also need to symbolize it. You symbolize the text. You remind yourself how important the Torah is, how important the Old Testament is, through the way that you dress. So you should tie a piece of the Torah as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. So you write it everywhere. You put it around yourself. It should surround your life. This is done for everyone, even for people who can't read. So this is in a synagogue. This is a bar mitzvah. This is when a boy is being entered into the community when he's 13. It doesn't involve a circumcision. Children are circumcised as babies. But during the bar mitzvah, the Torah is placed on the forehead. So there's a fragment taken from the Torah, put in a little box and tied to the boy's head. That's his father doing it. And that's a symbol of how he's surrounded by the Torah, surrounded by God's word. And it's also bound onto the hands. It's also commemorated in ritual. So in this sense, the Jews are similar to Egyptians or to the Assyrians, except that these rituals aren't rituals that commemorate a king. These are rituals that commemorate a story that is said in the canon, a story that is said in the Torah. The Torah prescribes the rituals that will cause the Torah to be remembered. It says, observe the Passover of the Lord, because in the month of Aviv he brought you out of Egypt by night. Sacrifice the Passover to the Lord your God, an animal from your flock or herd, at the place the Lord will choose as a dwelling. Do not eat with it bread made from yeast, but for 7 days eat unleavened bread, the bread of affliction, because you left Egypt in haste. So that's why Jews eat unleavened bread during the Passover. It's a reminder of the fact that they had to flee Egypt. They didn't have time to bake the bread properly. And they also have bitter herbs, the marab, which you dip into salt water, and they're a memory of the bitterness that the people have gone through in their suffering. And this is a family eating Passover in Egypt. Has anyone been to Passover? Has anyone done this? It's one of the prescriptions of a Passover is that children ask questions, and they have prescribed questions to ask, set questions to ask, the children should ask. So the children are given the questions, and in response, then different people in the family have responses. So they say, "No, Father, why did the Lord do this to us in Egypt?" And the father will respond. So there's set roles for everyone within a family. It's an early involvement of children into this narrative, and these are acknowledged as questions the children will ask for the story.
Why are the questions set beforehand?
Why? They are. Tradition has set them. It's also prescribed that everyone should drink more wine than they are used to, even the children. All children have to drink a glass of wine at Passover. And the food at Passover is also reasonably heavily prescribed because all the food carries ritual meaning. So obviously you have the Passover lamb, but you also have the bread, the last piece of unleavened bread is hidden, and what normally happens is the children are sent to look for the piece of bread, and then the head of the household will negotiate a price for their bread with the child. So the child who's found the bread will haggle, or the father will pay the child money for the last piece of bread in the house, the last piece of unleavened bread, and the children will try to band together to negotiate a shared price, and the father will try to separate them. So the training is that if you stick together, you get a higher price. But this is all embedded into the Passover ritual. It's one of the things that happens on Passover Eve. If you get an opportunity, I recommend it. It's really interesting. Another way that this memory is embedded is public inscription. This is what the text says, the Deuteronomic text. When you cross the river Jordan into the land the Lord your God is giving to you, set up large stones and coat them with plaster, and write on this all the words of the law when you've crossed over to enter the land the Lord is giving you, the land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, promised you. He says, don't use any iron tool there. Build the altar of the Lord your God with field stones and offer burnt offerings to the Lord. So Jews are being told to write this stuff down, write it everywhere, write it on their doors, tie it themselves, write it on massive stones so everyone can see it. Don't forget it. Don't forget it. This isn't just a story of a special relationship between God and the people. It's also a reminder that the people are different from all other people. They're different from the Gentiles. They have this special relationship with God. Everyone has the stars. They have the Lord. And they're told to write it down everywhere, to always remind themselves that they're different and special. And this is the crux then of Assmann's argument. The most important part of this is the creation of a book. Moses wrote down the law and gave it to the Levitical priests, who carried the Ark of the Covenant. Then Moses commanded them, at the end of every 7 years, in the year for cancelling debts, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place he chooses, you shall read this law before them in their hearing. So this part of the Bible already has a sense of the Bible being written down, as a notion of there being a text that can be read to the people, as a sense of itself. But there is an acknowledgement that in this land people turn to other gods. When I brought them into the land flowing with milk and honey, when they've eaten their fill and thrived, they will turn to other gods and worship them and reject me and break my covenant. And many disasters and calamities will come upon them, and this song will testify against them, because it will not be forgotten by their descendants. I know what they're disposed to do even before I bring them into the land. And Moses wrote down this song and taught it to the Israelites. So God is imagined to foretell the apostasy of the Israelites. This text is said to have been written before Moses enters the promised land. And it's said to be God anticipating that the people of Israel will turn to the many gods of the Canaanites. Of course, this is extremely unlikely, in terms of the historical order of the text. It's almost certainly a text written long after the people of Israel have entered the land of Canaan, probably several centuries after, written under the kings of Israel. So it's been actually written several centuries after when it's purported to have been written. And it's saying, look, there's no excuses. God anticipates that this thing will be tempting to worship many gods and go and marry foreign women. But there's no excuse because you've been told to remember. And there are those whose job it is to remind you. So the central strand that Aslan picks out of the book of Deuteronomy is God saying, this is how you're going to remember, and this is why you should remember. You should remember what you're remembering is that you're special. You're remembering a narrative that explains your specialness. And you're being warned against backsliding. You know that calamities and disaster will befall you if you ignore this special relationship that you have. You'll be justly punished. So that what Aslan stresses then is memory is something that binds people. It's something that constricts them. The identity of the Jews is something that binds them into this story. They're not free to escape it. Do you have any? Have you seen these texts before? Have you seen these passages from the Torah?
Yeah, here and there some of them.
Yeah. I mean, anyone else? Has anyone else seen these passages before? Read them?
So some of these were mentioned in one or two books of Aslan.
Yes, that's right. Yes. But have you encountered them, through Islamiyat or no?
Yeah, in the Quran, the story of the cow, the worship of cow.
Yes. So the Quran is said to presume. The Quran basically presumes knowledge of the Old and New Testaments. It presumes that it's speaking to people who know all the stories from the Old and New Testaments. But Aslan stresses this is the first time this has ever happened. It may seem obvious to us. This is the first time that this has ever occurred. This is why it says it's a revolution. That people are being bound into a story. They aren't allowed to escape the story. Who they are is determined by this relationship that their ancestors are supposed to have had with God. And everyone around them is all constantly told to repeat the story. So this is how social conditioning works. This is how social control works. Their specialness is something that constricts them, prevents them eating certain kinds of food, prevents them living in places that are inappropriate, prevents them marrying the wrong kind of people. And this prevention is justified through the story. And the story itself, it finds ways of insinuating itself into people's lives. It's bound on their heads, it's written on their door frames, it's repeated in rituals.
It is interesting in the sense that when we read this Torah, we can immediately connect that similar verses are there in Quran, which ask you to recall the verses of God, or attach yourself to a particular story, to a particular narration.
Yes, there's a theme of memory. I think something that's distinct. This runs right the way through the Abrahamic traditions. Memory going back to a specific story. Of course, the Quran is also obsessed with Abraham.
Yeah.
This all relies on the notion that there was a special inheritance of Abraham. The special land, Palestine, is given by God to Abraham. And the Quran's trick, of course, is to say the descendants of Abraham are actually the Arabs, not the Jews.
Bruce Filler's book was about.
Sorry?
Bruce Filler's book was about how Quran has been integrated into religion.
Yes, exactly.
So he was providing texts in which particularly that sacrifice thing has been mentioned, and how Jews try to prove that it was Isaac who was being sacrificed, and how Muslims say that was Ishmael who was being.
Yes. 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 So the origin, so the Torah talks about Isaac and Ishmael's minor character. So the Quran develops a number of minor characters from the Torah, like Sarah, Hagar, Ishmael, and it gives them a greater role. But it's always worth reading the Quran alongside the Torah and the Gospels to see what has been left out, what's been exaggerated. So they're interrelated stories. You can't really understand them independently without seeing the earlier layers. But that's not what we're doing here. Here we're primarily concerned not as historians of religion, but as theorists of religion. Our aim is slightly different. We're more interested in looking at how what being religion was, how what religion was has changes fundamentally with what the Jews do here. There's a new, Aslan sees this as a new technology. Would you like a little break now? You've had a chunk of Aslan. Do you want a little break, or do you want to keep him going? You have 5 minutes? Sure. Okay, so we'll have 5 minutes. We'll get to 1:30. So let that bed down. So if you find it useful, you might want to sort of look over your notes and take notes of the notes, or ask other people questions. But you don't have to. So we'll have a glass of water and come back at 1:30. So do you have any thoughts on Aslan's model? Is there anything about Aslan's model that disturbs you? Do you think it's unfair? What are its implications? He's been accused of being anti-Semite. Can you see why?
Any person who will have such a critical view will be accused of being an
yes.
anti-Semitic.
Sure. Do you think that's a legitimate criticism?
His perspective, results in having that view, that
Yes.
all these religions, they are man-made and nothing is divine about them.
Yeah.
So you get this perspective.
Yes.
In every.
Yes, so the starting point is.
Yeah. So implications are like very far-reaching for all those people who are very devoted to their beliefs and who are, teaching their children while they're walking on the road, while they're getting up, that this is how the life should be spent.
Yes.
But this particular perspective challenges their belief from the very core.
Yes, I don't see it as anti-Semitic, but I can see why people make that accusation. Also, he's a German making a criticism of Judaism, and in Germany especially, that's a taboo.
Yeah.
If he were Israeli writing this, it might be easier.
Then this perspective might be different.
Well, I'm not sure. There's some very secular Israelis out there. It depends. Anyway, he's not. So, any other thoughts on this model? Is it convincing?
Why do you think he is not anti-Semitic?
I think to be anti-Semitic is a statement about Jewish race.
Okay.
So anti-Semitism is a racist statement. It says that the world is divided into races, and some are very good, better than others, and that certain races have certain characteristics. And this is wrong because it has a biological underpinning that doesn't exist. That there's more generation. There's so much genetic variation within any given population that you can't talk meaningfully about race as a genetic.
Yeah, we studied in our second class.
But having said that, cultures do have things in common. They're products of upbringing rather than of race. Cultures may or may not be better than one another, depending on what criteria you're using.
But usually every culture claims to be, in a holistic sense, better than the.
Well, I'm not sure that's true anymore. I mean, that was true in the 19th century.
To a certain extent, it still happens.
Well, to a certain extent, it's not. Yes. I'm not sure it's true of all cultures. But I would say, so that's why I say he cannot be, he's not anti-Semitic, he's not making a statement. He's not saying that Jewish people are particularly inclined to believe all this stuff because they're Jewish. He's saying that there arose a particular class of people who became very effective in a certain kind of memory technology. And they produced narratives that entrenched their own power, and in so doing, changed the culture of most Jews for the benefit of that class of priests. So he's saying there's a specific historical example, there's a specific historical environment that allowed the production of these texts by a literate group of people, and that distorted the ability of other members of that group to select who they were going to be. And that closed down their choices with the object of preserving the boundaries of their group. I see the central tension of what he's saying is that wherever you have preservation of a group, preservation of an identity, preservation of practices, you do so by closing down people's options. So freedom and preservation are in opposition to one another. And I think he gets in trouble because that's something the world, people often lie to themselves about that. On the one hand, people say, my culture is valuable, I wish to preserve it. On the other hand, people say, I value freedom. And those are the sort of public statements in Western academia, Western thought, global thought, but certainly it's both prominent in Western thought. And he is showing, he's, I think, flagging up the tension, he's flagging up a contradiction.
We can also say that he's preserving in a sense that he's containing all the history from past to present one and bringing it to people.
Yes, I mean, this is probably something, this is not something that people think about. He's an Egyptologist, it's a very long view of the past. So he's contrasting very wide periods of past. So he's saying, I'm not anti-religious, I'm anti-monotheist. Opposed to monotheism, because monotheism has certain effects of monotheism in social and political terms that he's opposed to. So he says, so implicitly, I think, in reading bits of Aspen, he thinks monotheism implicitly gives a license to authoritarianism.
So, if we consider memory as something like we have selective memory, and that selective memory changes from time to time. So does Asman brings into factor the involvement of the role of extraneous factors, because extraneous factors and external factors.
What kind of external factors?
Like if we consider the cultural memory that existed in 18th century Islam,
Right.
18th century, and the cultural memory that is being promoted in 21st century Islam, taking it from the spectrum from at one end we have Ismailism, and at the other end we have Wahhabism. So for Wahhabis, the cultural memory will be different, and that cultural memory might constitute certain portions of like Sharia, which has been canonized, while Ismailis have a cultural memory that is evolving, and the role of Sharia or the ahadith or that canonized compilation of ahadith is minimal.
Yes.
As compared to.
Well,
So,
I mean, can I respond? So that's a really interesting contrast. I wonder if the presence of an imam, presence of an active imam, makes Ismailis much less subject to a canon. So if you have an imam who is the living Quran, he can, if you want him, not that I'm aware of him doing this, he could in a sense change the Quran. Is that right?
That's what I was talking about initially.
Yes.
That he may not change the Quran, he may or he may not, but
Is it
the
theoretically
interpretation.
possible? It's theoretically possible. Is that the implication?
So
No, of being living Quran.
No, the living
No, it is
Quran that
theoretically
is
possible.
true, but rewriting Quran that's not.
no,
really
theoretically it is possible
No, because
because we have
rewrite the
It has
he might
never been-
rewrite the constitution, or he might reinterpret, or he can make another constitution, but to write another Quran.
He may change the interpretations according to the
Yeah.
time,
Yes.
but not the
He would
actual
not
Quran.
change the text.
The text.
So,
Yeah.
for example, he may not say something that is completely contradicting to Quran,
Correct.
but he may say something that is considerably different from what is normally accepted in
Yes.
today's society or back then when it was
Yes.
Prophet's life.
Yes. Yes.
So that is possible.
So, I mean, as a number of you have pointed out in different ways, I suspect that one of the reasons that you make this spectrum between Wahhabis and Ismailis, I think, does work in the sense that Wahhabis are dealing with more canonized texts.
Yeah.
Now, often it comes down to interpretation, and I think it's often underplayed how much variation in interpretation there exists even among Salafis. So I think we have to be careful. But yes, certainly I think in groups where you have essentially reactive interpretation that is well disseminated and acknowledged, and Ismaili is an example of that, then yes, I think you can have very sensitive reactions to changing times. And in a sense, the concentration of the power of interpretation in the hands of one man facilitates that. So that could be a way of understanding that. Actually, the broader the priestly caste and the greater remit you give them, possibly actually entrenches the position of the canon. If everyone's entitled to interpret this canon themselves, then you're likely to get more parts of that canon will be touched by interpretation, and one effect will be to preserve the whole of the canon, to make it render it all as important. Whereas if you're just dealing with one individual's interpretation, you're likely to just have focusing on certain parts of that canon. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's how I would think about it. Okay, you're asking all the right questions. That's brilliant. It's exactly those kinds of thoughts that this is trying to stimulate. But I'm trying to do it using examples that you're not familiar with and get you to think about it in different ways. I just have a few more slides I just want to show you before wrapping up. So the theorist of religion, J.Z. Smith, points out that canons are not merely catalogues for the retrieval of information. It's not like the yellow pages. The purpose is not just getting stuff out. The relationship between parts of the canon is restricted. But how the canon has been developed implies certain order, certain ways that you allow it to interpret it. They're also closed books. You can't add in extra stuff, and that itself reduces the capacity for interpretation.
How does that reduce the capacity to interpretation?
So certainly, I suppose if you're seeing the model of the Quran probably doesn't work so well for this. But for the Bible, the fact that certain things happen after other certain things gives a context to everything. They're not free floating stories.
Okay.
It's something that happened. And next in Abraham's life, this happened.
Okay.
They're all successions of events. The same with the Gospels. That it's highly significant where in Jesus' life certain events occur.
So since Quran does not refer to time and space, that's
The
why it
Quran's
is.
absence of narrative makes it slightly unusual.
Okay.
And the interpretation of the Quran is not particularly respectful of order.
Yeah. Chronologically,
Yeah,
it is not.
that's not particularly important. Whereas it probably is important for most forms of canon. The Quran is slightly atypical in that regard. The other interesting point is that Smith says is this dries up the existence of a canon dries up the flow of direct information from God. Once you have a canon, it removes the need for prophets. You don't need prophets once you've got a canon. So normally people will say that you don't get prophets after Muhammad. Normally you don't get prophets after. You get a big rung of prophets all occur in the last generations of the Jewish exile in Persia, but you don't get any more. And that seems probably something to do with the writing down of the canon. So once you have a religion that can answer all the questions, you don't need people to come along and provide new answers by another mechanism. It removes the need for other mechanisms. And that's what Smith suggests. Agree with it or disagree with it. So prophets appear in circumstances where former canons don't seem to provide the answers to changing situations.
So this may suggest that at a point in future where Quran becomes inadequate to answer all the questions of that particular generation,
Then new prophets will appear. I mean, Smith doesn't take it into a modern period. His observations don't necessarily apply for an era of secularization.
okay.
But you could, for instance, say that the Ahmadi prophet appears as a response to the inadequacy of the Quran for 19th century Pakistan. You could develop an argument. Or you could say that these prophets appear in environments where people aren't familiar with the canon. People don't have contact with highly organized religious structures. Prophecy is in a sense a response to them. I'm not necessarily committed to Smith's argument, but it's something worth thinking about, I think, in terms of timing. It's something that might be an interesting thing to look at for your assignment. He also says that canons are rendered holy and pervasive by constant repetition. This is the same as Assman's point. The canon tells people to repeat it. Its justification for repetition is embedded inside it. And that's something that makes it pervasive. So that's something that Smith thinks sets canonical texts apart. They anticipate being repeated constantly. So you might want to return to that slide when you do your thinking. And I've left the page number at the bottom where Smith makes these statements. Smith is a very hard thinker to pin down. He's full of interesting thoughts, but he's a bit crazy. So don't worry if you don't get everything that Smith says, but those are 6 pages that I think you might find useful. It's only 6 pages. Now, I've written some more slides to do with, yes, here we are. So one of the things that canon does is create a notion of who we are, and it provides a set of expectations for what we should do, and it relates that group in space and in time. So if we do this with the Jews, it says the Jews are a group of people who will circumcise their children, who will obey a wide variety of dietary restrictions, who will worship one God, who will marry other Jews, who will obey a set of moral laws given to them by God, sets of expectations obeyed with regard to the rest of Jewish society and to God. They also have a special relationship to space and time. They are the descendants, the genetic descendants of a man who's specially chosen by God and whose descendants underwent all sorts of horrible things. And they underwent those because they were determined to remain a people together. They didn't want to compromise. They didn't want to undergo the compromises that the Persians or the Egyptians wanted them to undergo. They refused to worship other gods. They refused to bow down before kings. They refused to eat food that wasn't kosher. And they were willing to suffer for these things. And if they were willing to suffer, God would ultimately protect them. And a special mark of their peculiar relationship with God is the fact that God had promised this land of milk and honey to them. God's promised them a special land, and it's a mark of their special relationship with God, this holy land. And the notion of this holy land is something that keeps the Jews together even in diaspora. The notion that they all belong to this land. They have a sense of territoriality even when they don't actually live there. So it's something that the thought of that place will unite them. So something you also may see in Jewish events is the toast of Passover next year in Jerusalem. Have you heard of this? So the toast that people give, the toast with the wine at Passover, is you say next year we'll be able to do this. We'll be able to celebrate Passover in Jerusalem. The notion of this sort of centre that drags them all back. So it's not just a set of they're not just making a set of statements about history. This is all been about time. Right? They're not just making a set of statements about history. They're saying even when we are scattered, we are united by a sort of spiritual capital, a holy land that we've been given because of our special relationship to Abraham. This shared memory generates what's sometimes called an imagined community. This is a term coined by a thinker called Benedict Anderson. You may well have come across this idea. So it says that even though you don't actually know all other Jews, you've never met all other Jews, you can imagine them. You can imagine them how they are like you. You know that they all do the same things at the same time of year. You know that they all care about the same kind of things. You are on the same emotional pathway as the rest of the Jewish people. You're part of the same imagination. And that gives a sense of belonging. And it's in order to, when the Torah or the priesthood or the rabbis tell people to do things, it builds on that sense of belonging to assert homogeneous behavior. Because you were a Jew, that means you should take your sandals off before you enter the synagogue. Because you are a Jew, you should always eat with your right hand. Because you are a Jew, you should never eat milk and meat together. So it's saying this sense of identity, this sense of deep emotional belonging that you have, has consequences. You should all do the same things. And if it's good for one Jew, it's good for another Jew. So the sense that, so Assman's saying, a sense of belonging will itself will be homogenizing. If people share a sense of belonging, it will limit people's freedom to behave in different ways, encourage people to do the same thing. If there's a notion of a text that provides all the answers, then that will encourage homogeneous behavior. You can see the parallels to Christian or Muslim situations as well. And then that should transcend oral memory. So even if you say, oh, I remember my grandfather used to keep his sandals on in the synagogue, that doesn't become a justification for doing it yourself, which means your grandfather was wrong. There's a means of transcending oral memory of oral defenses. So you're saying that tradition, as represented in the Torah or what the rabbis say, goes against what you can see, what your peculiar memories of your own family. There is a normative sense of this. There's a normative sense of these prescriptions. From your sense of belonging is harnessed by these texts and by these priests to justify your behaviour and the same justifications are used for all other Jews. And that's always when Jews come into contact with religious institutions, that's going to be one of the features that causes them to do the same kind of stuff. They don't say, well, I don't really fancy obeying your rules, I can keep my sandals on. There's going to be someone who'll tell them not just that's wrong, but you're a bad Jew. That becomes the accusation. You can't escape from being a Jew, you just become a bad Jew. You fall lower down the hierarchy.
That's the difference in Islam and Judaism.
Well, because you can't, yes, because you...
Nobody will say you're a bad Muslim. After a particular time, you'll be excommunicated on the basis of someone's words.
Well, I mean, that's itself controversial, isn't it? I mean, takfir is itself highly controversial. Yeah. So it's maybe in some situations.
Yeah.
So this is just to summarize then, I think Assmann points to three crucial things to do with what's gone in the Jewish Revolution memory. The first is a portable homeland. They don't need to live in Israel to be Jewish. Egyptians need to live in Egypt to undergo these Egyptian rituals that are about Egyptian kings. Jews can live anywhere. They have a jealous God. The reason they can live anywhere is because they cannot compromise. They must not compromise. They must do the thing that God has told them to do. And what's the incentive? Well, partly it's belonging, partly it's notion of an imagined community, but that's linked to a special gift that's been given to them, the gift of Palestine. They've been given it by God. It's a special mark of God's favour to them. So being Jewish is linked to the gift of Palestine to Abraham. Right, that is, they're my thoughts on Assmann. Now, I'll offer you a choice, really. We can have a discussion of the things we've talked about here. We can talk more about Assmann and more about Judaism. Or I can go through the rest of the slides, which really talks about Christian material. But I was increasingly thinking that I think there's been quite enough. Yeah, you've had quite enough dense material, and we're already 2 hours in. So we have 3 hours of teaching. I think to give you 3 hours of teaching on the clock's a bit nasty. So what I might do is just leave them on the slides for you to look at if you want, and you can ask me questions about them. and to say that the rest of the class, what we'll do is talk a bit about memory and talk about, we'll sort of reflect again on what we've talked through in the lecture, and maybe also talk to you about how you think Assmann's insights might be applied to different contexts. So I thought that might be a simpler way of using that last bit of lecture. What would you think? Would you like me to? I can lecture you more, talk to you about another situation, but I don't want to complicate it. No new stuff. You've had enough. Good. I agree. So let's. So in that case, I'd like you to. Perhaps what I'd like you to do then is to think about how you could. What do you think the strengths and weaknesses of Assmann's model are? So there's two questions I'm going to ask you. I'd like you in your groups, and 2 groups of 4, talk about sort of split you down the middle here. 2 questions. Firstly, I'd like you to brainstorm what are the strengths and weaknesses of Assmann's theory, and secondly, I'd like you to think about how can you apply Assmann's theory to Muslim contexts. Do you find those interesting questions?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
That's we already did.
Yeah. Well, we've already started. There's much more to do. Because I was trying to. I wasn't letting you go full throttle on those issues. I was going to really you back in. But you know, the other slides are there. If you want to go through them and ask me questions about them, I'm very happy to do that. I didn't want anyone to get the impression somehow that I wasn't. I wanted you to have the impression that you could subject Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all to the same ways of thinking. So I wrote up the Christianity slides with that in mind. But if you don't, I think it's perfectly fine to talk about other issues now. But just so you know, I think there's a way of applying all the Asman theories to all 3 Abrahamic religions. So that's my material there. But it falls outside, I think, the precise interests of anyone here today. It's just so you know, I'm trying to treat them all equal, and that's why the Christianity slides there. Attach us a copy of us. Yeah. So first question. So this is what you're going to talk about now. What are the strengths and weaknesses of Assmann's approach? If you haven't read Assmann, then steal Atash's book and ask your friends.
So this was originally written in German?
Oh yeah.
And then translated?
Yes. I would not read it in German.
No German.
I can get by rather not read technical theory in German. I was in Germany in English.
This weekend?
Yes, I didn't have it. It was very cold.
The weather is chillier than here?
Yeah, it's awful. No, it's gorgeous this time of year. I love it. But
This weather is very pleasant for us.
no good.
Because back home is like really hot this time of the year.
Really?
Yeah, late 30s, early 40s.
Right. Oh, no. This is. I love this time of year in Germany. Right, talk. This is meant to be. You're meant to talk to one another. Exchange ideas. Shark it up. Oh, plus that. Come on, you can't hear one another.
What is the gentle? That was the reading for. What do you think the weakness are?
Can you explain or summarize these 2